have a more of a outdoorsy like type of research project that you work on. If you like being more so indoors and like being in a lab, then it could be more lab based. If you like computers and computer programming, that could also be kind of like what your project is focusing on. So there's lots of different components to it and aspects, and you won't necessarily like be forced to do something that you're uncomfortable with. And kind of want to talk about biogeochemistry just because that's like the next thing we're gonna hop into. It's kind of like a fun little interdisciplinary thing. It's basically like the combination of biology, geoscience, and chemistry all put together. So like biology, you know, like studying living organisms, including ones like you can't see. Geoscience, studying the earth. Chemistry, kind of looking at the like molecules or elements that kind of compose like various substances, and you kind of combine them all together, and it gives you like a really nice like in-depth study of earth processes. And I think it's kind of fun. But so I guess with biogeochemistry, I kind of started out initially studying river systems, and that was kind of like the prelude to me going into oceans. So I studied a river in southeast Oklahoma. I did not mean to do that, and kind of looked at how metals like mercury, lead, arsenic, and then like a few others were kind of like moving throughout the river environment. So that involved like studying surface water samples. So we do field work in the summer and winter time and collect water samples as well as collect sediment samples. And then we also looked at various mussel species. And these three mussel species are like endangered to the river. So these three like we didn't look at because legally you're not allowed to look at endangered mussel species or study them or collect them. But we kind of did all that to try and get an in-depth overview of how things were like moving in the river environment and kind of what that meant for like water quality and health of the river as far as like aquatic life went, like whether it was sustainable to host aquatic life and whether it was sustainable for like community members. And we were collecting samples in the summer and winter to try and look at how seasonal changes were affecting how like where the metals were at, because in wintertime there's generally a lot more like oxygen in the water, and so if there's a lot more oxygen, typically you shouldn't find like higher levels of metals in your water. Then you should find them in the summertime when there's like less oxygen and it's more like water levels are lower. But it also kind of related back to like a changing climate in a way, because if we could get a baseline now, then as climate changes, then like people can continue and build off of it and see how it's impacting how metals are moving in this particular river system. And that's kind of what we just like referred to as like biogeochemical cycling, just kind of seeing how things are moving through this river. And so the cool thing about mussels, and at least in doing this, is that they're benthic dwellings. So they like live on the bottom of your water body and they really don't move. So they're like living rocks in a way. And they provide ecosystem services. So they they kind of like make the environment around them like healthier for other aquatic life. And it's kind of because they're filter feeders. So adult mussels can filter 15 gallons of water a day, and they'll kind of filter the water and kind of accumulate all the toxins that are in the water. So like if you have an abundance of mercury, then they're going to take that up into them as they grow over time. But it means that the mercury levels around these mussel beds are going to be lower than if you didn't have a mussel bed, because the mussels are taking all that up. But the other unique thing about them is that they store CO2. And that's just because their shells, and I have two pictures over here, are made out of calcium carbonate, which is CaCO3. And to form calcium carbonate, you need CO2. So they'll actually pull CO2 out and accumulate that to help like build their shells and grow their shells as they grow over time. So in a way, they're like mini climate mussels. And they also, this will kind of become relevant, I think, in the next slide, but they have these like growth layers. It might be kind of hard to see, but they grow, they're very similar to tree rings. And so they'll grow like an annual growth layer each year. And they also have a seasonal layer, which means you can kind of use them to look at past seasonal and past annual changes. And then this is on the top right, is just a picture of like muscle tissue that we were drying out. And this is kind of what lab work kind of looked like. So we, at least for the instrumentations that I use and I continue using for the paleoceanography, paleoclimate stuff I use, we have to run liquid samples. So if we have a solid sample, we have to turn it into a liquid. And that normally is done through a digestion process, which basically you take your solid sample, you weigh out a certain amount of it. It varies depending on what the sample type is and like what acids and like combinations you're going to be using for it. But basically, like you weigh some of it out, you add in your concentrated acids, and then you digest it under high temperature and pressure. And then you kind of have it turn into a liquid, and then we have to dilute it because running concentrated acids through the instrumentation we have is really like damaging for it. And so you kind of wind up with a liquid sample that almost looks like water, but it's just basically your solid sample that got digested, converted into a liquid, and is just in really dilute acid now. But then we can run that on the instrument, and the cool thing about it is that the instrument will give us like the concentrations of any like element that we want to analyze. And then we can use that to kind of figure out like how much of it we have in our various different samples. The other thing that we can do, and it's kind of tied into the whole muscles with the annual growth layers, is that, yeah, they're similar to tree rings. And so that means that if you can study each individual growth layer, you can look at over time data. So you can actually go back in time, not as far back as you can with samples recovered from the ocean, which like we're going to kind of like go into next, but you can go back maybe like, I guess, recent time, and kind of look at seeing how floods and drought conditions happen, because mussels will record flood and drought conditions in their shells. They'll also record like seasonal changes, and you can also get ages because you could figure out how old the mussels are, and then you can use that and go, oh, like maybe like 30 years ago there was this flood, and then now we've had drought-like conditions in this river, and you can get all that information just from like studying individual mussel shells. And we kind of do this through like it's laser ablation. And so basically like you laser, so like this circle here is like the laser, you laser each individual layer of the growth layer of the mussel shell, and that can give you, you won't get exact concentrations, but you can get these ratios that you can then use to indicate for flood or drought conditions, as well as like seasonal changes and ages, and use that to look at like climate changes in more like recent past. Or you can just look at it to kind of assess like how a particular water body has changed over a certain period of time, like depending on what your research interests are. And just kind of like the last few things about it, with doing this is just kind of like assessing the local like environment and kind of just understanding the like geology types that are around it, just because changes in like erosional patterns and stuff can also like impact the signals that you see in your water body. And kind of what we found out from doing all this stuff was kind of trying to distinguish between whether these particular things we were looking at were naturally occurring or anthropogenic, like human induced. And so we have like a human influence index that kind of shows you human impact on particular areas in the US. So red is like really high human impact, like that's going to be like where a lot of like cities are at, or like just kind of having like a larger population of like humans in that particular area, or like maybe there's just a lot of built up like factories, industries, things like that. Green is going to be really like low levels of human influence. So really there's really not either like there's not a huge population of people, or it's just really like not a built up area. And so we're also trying to like compare that and try and see if there's any like correlation between like whether things might be more like anthropogenic due to like human impact, or whether changes we were seeing were just like from naturally occurring. And can kind of looked at the contamination factor with mussels, and tried to figure out where high levels of contamination were at, because that would be really helpful and indicator to figure out whether it might be anthropogenic or just like naturally occurring. And kind of found, at least for lead, was kind of we kind of had like moderate to like very high, but cadmium was kind of relatively like okay throughout the river environment. And then we just looked at the ecological risk index because that was something else we were like worried about, but kind of found that there was like low grade ecological risk, at least so far throughout the river. So that was good to find. There is higher grade values like elsewhere along the river, but not where the identified mussel beds are at. So that was at least like something important to keep note of, just like in case, but at least where the identified mussel beds are at, things looked relatively okay. And from that, I kind of like, I felt like that was kind of like a like small scale way of looking into how climate might potentially impact like a smaller area, more localized area. And I kind of wanted to expand that and look at things on a much larger scale. And so kind of for my PhD, like switched into doing more ocean-based research. So there's a cool program. It's the International Ocean Discovery Program, or IODP. And all of these dots on the map are where they have done scientific ocean drilling at. There's only 2 drill ships in the world right now. One is a US-based one, the JOIDES Resolution, or the JR, and the other one is the Japanese one. It's called the Chikyu. And they're the 2 main drilling vessels across the globe. But I am a shore-based scientist for 397, so they kind of drilled off of the coast of Spain and Portugal at the Iberian margin. And kind of what we do, at least with the paleoceanography, paleoclimatology stuff, is drill ships will go out. So this is a picture of the JOIDES Resolution. They'll typically take like a science party with them, and the science party will just be composed of scientists of different backgrounds. So you're going to have like your microbiologists, you're going to have geologists, you're going to have like geochemists, like just people of various different backgrounds together doing different analyses on the ship. And then samples will get sent out to all party members, because not everyone sails as well, just like due to circumstances or things that like come up. And what they kind of collect or recover are these like sediment cores. So this is a picture on the left, is an example of one of those sediment cores. And this one, there's a lot of like alternative, like what we call like layers in it that are kind of indicative of like changes that have happened that were like preserved in the ocean, and we kind of go out there and recover these cores. And what I'm kind of doing is looking at deep water current changes. And so deep water currents, they're very similar in a way to like rivers. They're kind of like referred to like the rivers of the ocean, just because they transport water from, you have like from the north that's going to be moved down to the south, and from like the south move up to the north. And so like from the north part, you have North Atlantic deep water. It's more warm just from where it originates from. And it's going to move southward towards Antarctica. And then you have Antarctic bottom water that's going to be like very cold water just because of where it's originating from. And it's going to move northward towards the North Atlantic area. And you have areas where they mix. So that's kind of how you get your intermediate waters at. But climate, like atmospheric CO2, is very much interconnected to these deep water currents. So actually, like right now, there's one current that scientists are kind of like looking at. It's the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. It's also in the Atlantic, but it's weakening, and it's weakening from the continuous like increase of atmospheric CO2. And so kind of by us studying how current changes happens in the past, like kind of maybe like how the Antarctic bottom water kind of either like strengthened or reduced in the past, can kind of help us better figure out like what might happen in the future depending on how atmospheric CO2 like changes. And we do that through these sediment cores that are recovered. And so at least for me, I have two study areas where I'm kind of like looking at these current changes. One's down in like the Scotia Sea, kind of near Antarctica, and one's up at the Iberian margin. And this way I get to see like influence of where Antarctic bottom water kind of like originates, and then also where North Atlantic deep water like kind of originates, and can kind of like compare the geochemical signals that I'll talk about in the next slide, just about how they kind of change and what that might mean for like strengthening and reducing of these currents. And this is just kind of a more in-depth diagram about these oceanic currents, and it's kind of cool because like you can't really see them, but they're there and they're moving water, and they strengthen and weaken depending on atmospheric CO2. And so it's all very interlinked, and I find that like very fascinating. So for me, since I do geochemistry, I use what we call redox praxes to try and look at how these currents strengthen and weakened over time. Redox praxes are just indicative of oxygen changes. And so if you have low oxygen, you're going to have higher concentrations of these redox elements in your sediment samples. If you have oxygen conditions, like there's lots of oxygen in the water, they're going to more so hang out in the water because they're just going to enjoy hanging out in the water. And so you'll have a lower concentration of them in your sediment. And so you can look at how they're like, how higher concentrations and lower concentrations change as you go like up your sediment core. And that can be indicative of climate changes that have happened in the past, and like major paleoclimate events, or even regional ones. Like maybe there's one that happened specifically in one area, and you can look at that and get that and figure that one out. So I primarily use like vanadium, uranium, and molybdenum, and just they're going to be more enriched in the water column. So like you'll have a lower concentration in the sediments just under oxygenated conditions. And then under anoxic, which is like low oxygen, or eustenic, which is more like, it's more like sulfur rich, but it's still low oxygen. You'll have higher concentrations than in the sediment, because they'll just like rapidly like form these reduced species with like iron, like forming like iron sulfides and other things with in the sediment. And so then you can figure out, like based off of whether you have like an enrichment of it, like a really high concentration or low, you can kind of figure out how atmospheric CO2 might have like fluctuated in the past. And generally they develop an age model with these cores, which is just figuring out, you know, at what points in, like at what depths you have, like what age you're at and what time period you're at. And so then you could then take your graphs of these like I guess like enrichments, depletions of these metals, and compare it to the age model. And then now you've just figured out like, oh, you know, like here's this major climate event, and this is where I see like my big increase, and you can use that to kind of correlate past climate changes and do that. And this is kind of I guess like lab work that I do, so still similar format. I got a whole bunch of samples like shipped to me from Expedition 397. And then we kind of like dry out our sediment samples. We digest them under high temperature and pressure. It's just a different looking apparatus, but same format as in the video with the river work. And then we analyze them on an ICP-MS, which is the same instrument that I used in previous research. And so it's still the same process as preparing your samples. And doing that. This is just with marine samples. And kind of just to like, I guess, tie it majorly into like climate stuff. So like the last 20,000 years are characterized by changes in ice sheet growth, or like glacial cycles, and ice sheet decay, or interglacial cycles. And so kind of what we had like in Antarctica was we had period of warming, and then what we called like the Antarctic cold reversal, where it went like really cold. But at the same time in the North Atlantic, it was warming, and then it got cooler, and then it got really hot. And we kind of I guess not we, because I didn't help nickname it, but scientists named it like the bipolar seesaw, because if Antarctica was doing one thing, the North Atlantic was doing something completely different. and then they kind of like got together again around like 11,000 years ago, which is about like the Holocene, and both started warming again. But before that, you kind of had it to where they were kind of doing opposite trends. So if Antarctica went cold, the North Atlantic was like, I'm gonna be hot. And if Antarctica went hot, North Atlantic was like, I'm gonna be cold. But we can figure that out, and that's like been figured out by studying these marine sediment cores and kind of reconstructing these geochemical proxies that we have. And then with like computer science work, like people have done like modeling to try and figure out like if we have this situation, what's that gonna do to like kind of like past climates, and trying to mess with the models to try and see different changes and what adds up and what doesn't add up. But all of this stuff can kind of help us be like prepared for like future changes and try and understand like future changes that might happen based off of what happens in the past. And that's kind of like the last slide that I had. But there's a whole like, it's from the American Geophysical Union, but they had an issue come out last August with like 19 different scientists, but all kind of like early career, like PhD or postdoc, like doing various different like research things. So there's a lot more like research stuff that's out there that's different to geochemistry. If doing like chemistry or biogeochemistry stuff like isn't your thing, there's other like research areas out there that do different projects but are still like climate related and like paleoceanography related too. So there's a lot of options out there. But I'm happy to like answer questions and chat more about things, or if you want a lab tour, I'm in the lab and I can show you things like in the lab.
What is the most compelling evidence for climate change you've seen personally from your research?
Oh, that's a good question. I think for me, the most compelling evidence that I've seen has one been, at least with the river that I studied, there's like been like a lot of just dead mussels like found around, and mussels are very sensitive to their aquatic environment. Like they have it's like 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and they don't like it if the temperature changes like too drastically. And the river levels also like had been like consistently low to even during the winter time when we would expect it to be higher, just from increased like precipitation and snow and things like that. And that was kind of really like eye-opening to see and be like, wow, it's like legit impacting this like right now. And then with the marine side of things, just kind of like when you analyze samples and you get like this big peak of some of the elements that I look at, and I'm just like, oh, that is like, that correlates to this paleoclimate thing. And it's kind of like, oh yeah, so that did happen. And then you look at the sediment sample and you're like, oh, it's like completely different than everything else. And like, yeah. So I think like those two things were kind of like the biggest evidence of it. And at least like just talking about how deep water currents are weakening too, I kind of think are all like the three things that are kind of more like, I guess, eye-opening for me and things I've seen up close. Yeah, Brittany.
I don't know if you can hear me or not. Can you make me out?
Oh yeah, I can, yeah.
Sorry. So I noticed that it said you're from Oklahoma State University. So what brought you, because obviously there's no ocean around you whatsoever. So did you just naturally fall into this? Did research bring you here, or like in an area where the ocean was that made you want to do it? Like, did they even have like marine programs in Oklahoma for that kind of stuff? Or do you have to go to a different state in order to learn it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I actually grew up in Southern California, and lived like I was kind of like near the beach area, at least was like 20 minutes from the beach. So I kind of grew up being around the oceans, and I always found them fascinating. But moved to Oklahoma like going to my junior year of high school. But there are, I guess there are some professors at OSU that do like marine research and have been involved in these like expeditions. And so I kind of had faculty here that was already doing marine research that I could get involved in, and had samples from previous expeditions that I could start working with to try and figure out like what I was gonna work on for my PhD. And they also taught like marine classes as well, just because their background was in marine. So it wasn't like an official marine program, but there was the opportunity to do like marine research, even though we are in a landlocked state. But I mean, there are other universities that have like actual like oceanography programs and like marine programs, and it's like a separate entity compared to ours is just kind of morphed into geology. But I think for me, it kind of also like came down to like who I wanted to work with out of like the schools that I applied to, and kind of made the choice like based off of that too.
Oh, thank you. I also have one more follow-up question because you kind of just like made me think about this, because you know how a lot of like fish nowadays has high mercury levels and stuff,
Mhm.
and you talked about how the mussels are like filtered or feeder, or they like filter out of the water. So would you say the other fish in the area were considered healthier than said ones that were in a different area where there were no mussel filters like feeders and stuff? Because obviously that's like big. Also, I'm pretty sure you probably wouldn't be allowed to eat the mussels, right? Because they have the mercury in them and all the other heavy metals and stuff. So they're just there to keep that aquatic environment healthy, right?
Yeah. So I guess it's a little tricky with fish because they do like migrate up and upstream and like downstream. So I guess it kind of makes it a little tricky, but in theory, yes, if there's like really no mussel beds around them, then they in theory would be able, I would expect them to have higher levels of like
Yeah.
mercury in them. And then as far as like the mussels go, like I don't think people ate mussels from that particular river, but like people still kind of like eat mussels and collect them anyway. It's kind of just they try and follow like the guidelines that are out there. The
Yeah.
DEQ has some for like shellfish and fish and other things as well. And I think it's just like people just trying to follow the guidelines. So that hasn't
Yeah.
stopped people from eating them. It stopped me from eating them though. So
Yeah. Thank you.
yeah, Caitlin.
Hi. So I was wondering, do you prefer lab work or like field work? Which one do you like most?
Oh, okay. I will say that I am like a 50-50 split. I like being outdoors, but I also like doing lab work because I'm not a big fan of cold weather. So whenever it's cold, I'm like, I get to be inside. Yay. um, so yeah, it's a good 50-50 split, but yeah, it's a 50-50 split. I enjoy both. Both are fun for
Your
different reasons.
what is your dream location to do field work? Like where would you love to go?
Okay, this is gonna sound really hypocritical, but I think it would be really cool to like do field work in Antarctica, or at least like go on an expedition to like the Antarctic area and like do that. And it's really ironic and a little hypocritical because I don't enjoy cold weather, but I think I would suck it up for that. Yeah, Jennifer.
So you mentioned how you did what you went over the expeditions and stuff in Spain. Would you hope to one day be on one of those expeditions collecting the field work?
Yeah, definitely. I think I would love to get some like shipboard experience and like be part of that and do that. So yeah, for sure. Yeah, Victoria.
I know you said that you enjoyed lab work and field work 50-50, but when you go into the lab, how many hours would you say you spend? Like, I'm sure it varies, but
Yeah. It does vary depending on what I'm kind of like working on, but I would say anywhere from like 6 hours on average, I'd say. Just because like sample prep time and things. Sometimes it's longer if I'm doing if I'm running the ICP, because the ICP analyses take like a long time to do, but I'd say an average like 6 hours.
But Lauren, that 6 hours is like, sometimes you will sit down and read something, and then, you can still do other things, check an email, and then, right? It's just like, yeah, it's not just all standing there and doing work.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
I
no,
want
for
to
sure.
see
Yeah.
it,
That's a good point. Yeah, you're not just like standing there and everything. Like sometimes you have to wait on things. So like you could like check emails or go on social media or text people and do other things too. So yeah. And some labs have ways to remotely log into instrumentation and other things. So sometimes you don't actually you just have to start it and then you just have to watch it from a different location instead of being in the lab too. So there's some labs that have that option as well. Yeah. And there's also chairs too, so you can sit around too.
Hi, can I get a view of what your lab looks like?
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna turn my camera around the other way so that way you all don't see me on this lab view thing. Okay. Let's see if my camera's gonna start moving with it. Or did it decide to freeze on me? Oh, that'd be ironic. Oh no, there you go. Is it gonna freeze? Okay, there we go. I guess this is one of our first aid areas, just because we do have HF in the lab. HF is like a really dangerous acid. We have to have specific training we do to work with it. But it's also why we have a lot of first aid kits. This is the digestion part of our lab. So this is kind of where we do all of digestion stuff at. And I have some actually on the hot plate right now. So they're kind of over there. And this is kind of our fume hood where we do a lot of our work at. It's specifically designed to deal with inorganic acid chemistry work. So the stuff that we do is dealing with inorganic acids like nitric acid, HCl, things like that. We have our ovens where we dry out our samples at. And sometimes we name them. So right now this is Harold. So that's always something fun you can do in the lab when you're in the lab group. You guys can take turns naming different things. This is our ICP area. This is kind of where we dilute all of our samples at for analyses. So we kind of have this working station here. There's just 2% nitric. Kind of have our scale. This is our ICP setup over here, and then kind of our computer that's connected up to it. And then we have a fridge and freezer with more samples in it. And then this is what we call our blue lab area. So this is kind of where we will crush samples at, because our sediment samples have to be dried and then homogenized. And then we have an Eltron here for carbon and sulfur analyses. And then this is our other door of our lab, or main lab entrance, and then lab coats and stuff. So yeah, that's kind of a gist of our lab area. I think it's more in general rectangular shape. And we have this because this isn't part of our lab, but it's just empty space that isn't part of our lab, but no one is using it, so it's just empty space.
It's a very big lab. Do you have your own office, or do you share an office with other people? It looks the office looks. I mean, the lab looks very modern. I used to work in a much older lab.
Yeah. It varies, at least at OSU. So some PhD, they have a PhD student office in a different building, but for geology, because geology is actually in a different building than the building I'm in, but the building I'm in is more of like their research building, at least where they put the chemists and biologists and physicists and geologists in like the same building together, just on like different floors. And so we have like this open space layout, and everyone has like all the grad students have their own desk, but it's not like private. Like you're kind of going to see everyone, and like you can hear people and stuff, but you have like your own desk area, and you have like drawers that are yours and everything. So you have like your own little space. It's just not like your private own little space.
Was probably designed to so that you guys can, you know, talk to each other and learn from each other, right?
Yeah, and there's like a tea kitchen in there too, which is nice because then you can like make coffee or tea. And there's a fridge and there's a microwave. And there's open space too, so you can have like group discussions and things as well. So it's very helpful for like having group meetings and kind of like promoting dialogue amongst like your peers and stuff and doing that. And like professors' offices are also there, like at least the professors who have labs in this building. So they're always like around in their office, so you can always like get them if you have questions or need them. So it's very helpful in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, unless somebody else has a question, I have another question. Can you talk about, like, you know, the social life, like, you know, as a graduate student? Like, do you gather? Do you have time to?
Yeah. So at least right now I have time for a social life. I hope that continues. We also, at least at OSU, they also do a really good job of like trying to promote having a social life as a grad student. Like there's a lot of events that they do specifically for graduate students to try and be like, oh hey, we're having like this lunch thing or this gathering thing or like this evening gathering thing and just kind of like things like that. And then there's also student organizations across campus that are specific to different disciplines. So like there's geology graduate student association, there's one for like biology, zoology, and just all the disciplines. And then they try and do events as well for graduate student bodies, and those would be more specific to the discipline and just try and promote that as well. And then the departments are really good about promoting things. And then just kind of like you all start in the same cohort. I guess like there's generally like an orientation that happens before school actually starts for graduate students, just to kind of go over kind of like resources of the university and kind of where you can find things at, and just kind of like an accumulation of information that they kind of give to you. But you do that with everyone who got admitted into the program with you. And so you kind of get to meet everyone who's starting out when you're starting out. And that kind of helps build like camaraderie and like kind of gets you some like social connections like right off the bat. Because if you don't know anyone going into like university you're going to, orientation is like a great way to kind of meet the people who you're starting out with, because these are going to be the people you might be taking classes with, but you'll at least be in the same like timeline with, and so you can like talk about, you know, research and where you're at and things like that. And then if you're in a lab group, there's also like social gatherings with lab groups. So we can still like have a social life, and like at least OSU tries to like promote events to try and like encourage you to like socialize and have activities to do outside of just like being in the lab or doing computer work or whatever it is that you're working on.
I knew that I see that you also have kind of talked to the legislatures regarding, you know, the climate policies. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Oh yeah. So I do science policy work with the American Geophysical Union and the Soil and Water Conservation Society primarily, and kind of like advocate or meet with legislators about climate related legislation and like water related legislation. And then also just also like advocating for like STEM funding in general. And do that. And that's something I didn't know you could do as like a grad student, but I kind of got interested with like the research and work I was doing, and was kind of like, is there a way like I can kind of take what we're doing like research wise and bring it to legislators, or at least like use it as a way to support particular piece of legislation, or to like try and encourage like an area of focus for a particular piece of legislation and do that. And I kind of found that a lot of like these science organizations have opportunities for grad students to get involved in policy work, where they'll kind of like train you, and it's not like a huge where it's not like a huge time commitment either. Like AGU, they have a program, it's like Voices for Science, and they have a science policy track, and if you get in, it's for like 1 year. But you can continue doing work like after the 1 year is over, but like each month you kind of like meet with legislators and do that, but they kind of let you do it for what you're interested in doing, so they don't like pick the legislation for you necessarily. You can pick your own area of interest and do that. And there's like a lot of organizations that have like similar programs to that too, for like early career scientists and students to kind of get involved in and to try and to kind of like in a way test it out and see if like you like it. But yeah, it's something that I didn't know you could do as a student, because I kind of was like, I have to wait until I get like get my degree and then I can go like have these meetings. And then I was like, oh my gosh, you don't have to, you can start having them now, because like you're doing the science and you're doing the research, and so like if it's an area you're knowledgeable in, you can start like bringing it up like now.
That kind of reminded me another question. So I think you already talked about it, in the beginning, I think you were thinking of, one career direction, and then you realized that, through gardening that, probably I am more interested in this. And now since you're already talking to the legislators, one day, like after you graduate, right? So you actually have many options. You don't have to be a scientist or a professor. There are other career options, right? So what are you thinking about? I mean, it's still early for you, but what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I want to be a professor, because like I like teaching and doing research, and I feel like that'd be like the best position to be able to do that in. But I guess if I change my mind, then yeah, there's other options I could do. And I think that's like the cool thing about like pursuing like the graduate degree, because it kind of opens up the door to like doing science policy, or there's even careers now in science communication where you don't do the research, but you're the ones who's communicating it to the general public and doing that. And so there's a lot of like cool careers out there.
Science journalist, you can be a book author, right? So you can be,
Yeah.
you can even get a GD, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's cool. You could kind of like hop around in a way, because I even hopped around when I started doing research and was like, oh, I'm gonna try this out, and I'm gonna try this, and then this, and now I've just kind of settled. And I'm like, okay, I think I found the area that I like the most. But it's kind of like the fun thing with being a student too. Like you could hop around, and then even in your career, I know some people that have like hopped around, but all of their experiences that they had were actually like really helpful for their next career. And so like none of the experience that you have or hopping around that you do is wasted. Like it all helps you in every like single thing that you do.
I have a question. Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, hey, sorry. So I have a question. I was watching you kind of give the tour of the lab and looking around and everything, and like I recognize some of the stuff, but like it looks a little overwhelming to somebody who's never been in a lab. And I was thinking about asking, like, okay, well, the first time you went into a lab, or that lab maybe, I don't know which lab was your first, but did it feel overwhelming? Or did you kind of like already know, like, oh, this is what this is, this is what this is, and they just turn you loose and let you do your work? Or is it like you do a lot of on-the-job training? Because to somebody who's like I'll be honest, I just switched my major like 1 semester ago to biology, and now I'm trying to figure out what I want to do in biology. And I'm like, okay, from where I am now to the stuff I don't know, all the way to working in a lab, looks like, I mean, the gap is, I don't even know what's between me and doing something like what you do. So I don't know if you'd be able to fill in the gap and kind of explain like, okay, now you take a class on X, Y, and Z beforehand that kind of prepares you for, or not, or if it's just all on the job training once you get in. I don't.
Yeah, oh, that's a really good question. So for me, they don't throw you in and just be like figure it out. There's a lot of training that goes into it. And generally you're not let loose by yourself until you're comfortable on your own and you're comfortable doing whatever it is in the lab that you're going to be working on like on your own. And it was also very overwhelming, like the first lab that I was in, including this one. Like each lab each lab that I've worked in is always overwhelming, like the first few times going in it, just because it's new and you're not familiar with like the layout and where things are at, and it can be very, very overwhelming. But they have like lab safety training that they'll do. It's very like straightforward training, and they have all of the information that you cover are always in like a binder in the labs, just because that's what's required by law. But they go over that before you're even allowed to start working the lab, and that way you at least are aware of like what to do depending on like a situation. And the person who does the training is like always around, and it's generally like the professor of the lab or the lab manager, or even like a postdoc, just whoever it is that's like qualified to do the training will be the one to do the training, and they're always going to be around. So if you ever have like more questions about things or need something explained in more detail, like they're happy to do that. And then after the lab safety training, you'll then get trained on whatever it is you're going to be doing in the lab. So if that's like preparing samples, you'll have someone who has done that before and has done it enough times that they're comfortable doing it. And that might be the professor who runs the lab. It might be a graduate student that's been working on that particular sample prep for a while. And they'll kind of like show you the ropes of how to do it, but you won't have to do it on your own until like you're comfortable with it, like doing it on your own. So if that's like one day and you're like, I'm good, like set me free, then it'll be one day. If you're like, oh no, I need like, I want to have you here like for a few more days or something like that also can happen too, and do that. And then the same thing for instrumentation. They'll train you on it, like you'll get trained on how to use it. And then kind of before they set you free in general, whoever it was that trained you on it will kind of just hang out like around the lab area while you're kind of like running it. And that way, if you have questions, like they're right there, they can help you. If there's an issue, they can help you. But that way you're also kind of like doing it on your own. And then they'll kind of like release you once you're like comfortable. But it really just comes down to like you'll get trained, and then whenever you're comfortable enough to do it on your own, then you can then do it on your own. But there'll always be someone around, like with especially for like chemistry labs, there's always an additional person like around it in the lab, just in case of like emergencies or safety issues. So you're never like totally alone either.
And you are allowed to make some mistakes, right? So it's
Oh,
like
yeah.
not major ones, but don't
Yeah,
break
no.
also,
you-
like I guess if they take you, if they accept you to the program, after reading your resume, after knowing that you have taken some certain courses, they have faith in you, right? They know that you can quickly learn. I think I definitely learned pretty much everything after I moved to the US, like 20 some years ago. Didn't know anything about those instruments, but you will learn slowly, and one day you're going to train other people. Right?
Yeah. So that's like the fun thing when you start training other people and you're like, how did I get to this point? Like I didn't realize I was at this point yet. But yeah, and it's totally cool to make mistakes because mistakes happen. And then you just kind of like redo it, or if it's like something glass breaks, they have the glass trash area, you just put it in there. Like no one's gonna get mad at you for making a mistake, just because it does happen. And even it happens with professors and people who have been doing this for like years. So there's no one expects you to be perfect and like know what you're doing right off the bat. And like I'll add too for that this is more like class wise, but like I failed my first chemistry class I took during undergrad and had to redo the class. But it kind of is ironic because now I'm doing like research that's more heavily chemistry based. But one of my professors described it as a hiccup, and like he didn't get mad or anything. He was just like, oh, it's a hiccup. Everyone does it. Like, you want to just try again? And I was like, you're making this into a much less bigger deal than I was making it. But like that happens, and as much as it sucked the first time, like redoing and everything and kind of going through that was kind of like, oh wow, like these like that wasn't that was like I thought that was a big deal, and then it was kind of, they were just like, it's a hiccup, and I was like, okay. So even things like that can happen. It's just kind of like, don't let it like stop you from pursuing what you want to do. Like if you make a mistake or if you hiccup, like, but you still want to pursue that field, like don't let that be the thing that stops you from pursuing it.
So since you are in your second year, I know that very soon, I don't know if you're still doing the process is still the same. You're very soon you're going to take the qualification exam, or do you still have that, or?
Yeah, I did my quals last year, and then I defended my proposal back in February. But it does vary by university. So I will say that kind of the unfortunate thing with PhDs is the qualification process varies by university. Some universities now do it where you just have to defend your proposal, but they have you write 2 of them. And so one of them you can take with you if you want to do like a postdoc or like a research position elsewhere, and the other one you do as your PhD. Other universities you have to do like an exam and then defend your proposal that you write, which is like just like the research you're going to be working on. So it unfortunately it varies by university. But
So when I was a graduate student, the failure rate is, I mean, there are still a few students, who would fail, in the beginning they're in this PhD program, and then after 2 years they're gone. So we were all very kind of definitely stressed and very scared by that process.
Yeah, I will say it kind of seems now, I'm sure there are exceptions to this, but it kind of seems now that professors aren't really letting their students defend until like they know they're gonna pass.
I see.
But I'm sure there are exceptions to that. Like I'm sure there are professors that don't do that. But from what I've seen and experienced, and as far as like my friends too, like it just kind of seems to be like professors aren't letting them defend unless like they're probably gonna pass. Yeah. And I guess I'm just gonna throw it out there, but there's this program I could throw it into the it's called STEMCs. If you like Google STEMCs, it's like an undergraduate experience for and like community college experience for students, and you could spend like 10 days out at sea, and they do like a program like each year. But the people who run it are really nice, but just kind of if you're interested in getting seagoing experience, they like will come out with different like options that you can go on throughout the school year, just like in case that's of interest. But I saw your hand up, Caitlin, if you have a question.
I'm just completely ignorant to the whole defending the proposal. What does that entail? What do you have to do for that?
Oh yeah. Okay. So for that, the first part of it is you have to like write this proposal. There's no set length for it. It's kind of what your advisor kind of wants you to write up. The cool thing about it is whatever you write can then be used in either like your thesis or your dissertation work. So it's kind of almost like you're writing the background portion of your dissertation or thesis, but as part of that, you're just saying, oh, this is what I want to investigate, and like have your hypothesis in there. And then the defense part is the and this part like varies by university, whether it's more of like a public proposal defense or whether it's just with your committee. If it's public, it just means your defense state will be sent out to the entire like department, and so that means like your friends could go, your colleagues, other professors. If it's private, it will just be you and your committee, which could be anywhere from like your advisor plus like 2 additional faculty members, or like your advisor and like 4 additional faculty members, depending on whether you're doing like your master's or your PhD. And then you'll kind of basically would have made like a PowerPoint presentation that's just basically covers what you wrote as your proposal. And so you're just then like orally defending it and talking about like the background, kind of like what's missing, and then kind of like how your research is going to like fill in these gaps or kind of like contribute to advancing the field and do that. And then your committee will like ask you some questions. If it's public and you have other people from your department there, then they might ask you some questions. And then they like kick you out. And if you're in Zoom, it's kind of weird because they make you leave Zoom and then you have to rejoin again. And when they kick you out, the committee like debates about things or whatever. And then they'll bring you back in and they're like, you passed. Or they'll be like, you passed, but like we want you to read this paper or do this one thing or whatever. And do that. And then once you've done that, like that's kind of the proposal defense process. And then the next defense thing you have to do is your one to like defend the research that you've worked on at the end of it, which is more so like, this is what I did and this is what I like concluded. And I will add that you can also change your research project. So even what you defend as your proposal can also change and not necessarily be like your actual research that you do, because sometimes like instrumentation can break or things happen or like sample collection may or may not like may have to be modified or whatever, like things happen and people are aware of that. So even if you defend something, there's the possibility that it might not be exactly what you're defending at the end of it. But yeah, but they generally have you practice it and everything too. So like it's not just like a blind thing, like go out there and defend this like you haven't had time to practice. Like generally your advisor will like run it through with you and like approve it and make sure it's good. And that way, you know, your advisor's like on board with what you're presenting, and that helps. At least that helped me, because I was like, at least I know my advisor likes what I'm presenting. So
So Lauren, in the past, a PhD used to take on average 5 years. I hear that it's getting longer. What's the average right now?
yeah, I think the average is
So.
like 5 or 6 years.
Mhm.
And I think part of that, at least right now, is just because of like we had like the pandemic and it switched everything to virtual, and like different states have like different kind of, I don't know how to best describe it, but like it's not universal across like across states either, and so that's also like impacted grad students and their ability to do research. Because if you work in a lab then and you like can't get in the lab, then that's gonna like halt your research until you're able to do that.
So the fact is that it's actually not a fixed number of years. It's really how fast you are able to finish your proposed project.
Yeah.
Are there, it's a dumb question, but like I said, I just switched my major over to biology, but are there any jobs that maybe are similar or even maybe not similar, but that you know of that are like somebody asked, like whether you like working outdoors or indoors? Are there any jobs that are just like almost all outdoors, or is it kind of always sorry, I'll let you go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. Yeah, there's with the state agencies like USGS and like the like Department of Wildlife and Department of Environmental Quality and the EPA, they have like field technician positions. And so basically like you would be out in the field for most of your work, and you'd be the ones to like for example, some of these agencies have like string gauges on rivers, and so you'd be the ones to go out there, like replace a string gauge or gather data or even do like field sample collection that would then get tested in the lab. And then for wildlife, like they have like the cameras set up, and they need to do like counts, like in Oklahoma they need to count like bear cub populations and other things. So you'd be primarily like out in the field doing like all the field work stuff. So the field technician positions are the ones that be primarily outdoors. And they also have those for universities. So there's some lab groups that hire field technicians because they have like extensive field work sites, and then that's kind of what you would be doing. You would be basically helping students out and the professor out with their field work site and like sample collection and everything like that. But it would primarily be like an outdoors type of position.
But a tech position does not require a PhD or even a master's degree, right? So I think the higher the degree that you get, the less opportunity that you have probably to stay outside. Not necessarily. But I have another question regarding regarding like, the leeway. I knew that when I was a graduate student like 20 some years ago, the tuition is covered completely, and then I received I think only $15,000 a year as living costs. For renting the apartment and all of that. I know that the number must have gone up a lot. So do you mind sharing like how much so first you guys should know that for PhD, most programs will pay you, right? So they're going to pay you. It's compared to other jobs, like a small amount, but should be sufficient to support you and possibly another family member.
So it's still the same process. So either whenever you get admitted to the program, you'll get an offer letter, and in your offer letter it'll tell you like your what you're getting paid and your position that you're going to have. So they have like one position is a teaching assistant position, and that basically is at least it varies by your discipline that you go into. So for geology, for example, teaching assistants kind of teach the undergraduate geology labs. So like our general geology, like first geology class freshmen take, we have a lab section for it. And so the TAs are the ones who teach that lab section. You don't have to develop your own material for it. Like the professor who teaches the class is the one who's in charge of the lab, and he gives you the lab material that he wants you to cover during the lab. There's at least at OSU, like in geography, some of their TAs like get to like actually like teach like a undergrad lecture course,
Sure.
but it's one like freshmen will teach.
That's a great group practice, yeah.
Yeah. And then there's also research assistant positions. So if the professor you're working with like has a research grant, or if there's another professor who has a research grant and your experience or expertise or classes that you've taken would make you a really great fit for it, you could get a research assistant position. So you wouldn't be teaching, but you would be working on a project. Like either it would be the project for your research and your advisor is the one who's paying you, or it'd be like another professor that's paying you to work on a project. And then they also have graduate assistantships. These are more like office desk work. And you'd be kind of like be put into like an office and kind of helping out with various things like that. But each of these assistantships comes with like a monthly stipend, health insurance, and also with tuition waiver as well. So then you don't pay tuition, you get your monthly stipend, and you get health insurance, at least like through the university, that also is then applicable to like other like ERs and stuff around like your university area. And then aside from that, like there's also funding you can get like on your own if you were interested in applying for it. Like there's the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship that you can apply for. And if you do that, it's $138,000 like over 3 years. There's other like graduate fellowships that you can also like apply for, but like if you don't, or if like you choose not to, or if like you don't get it, then there's also like the assistantship positions you can get at universities. And generally if you get like a TA position, they don't make you teach a class that you don't have like experience in or aren't like comfortable teaching. Like they'll have you teach something that you're comfortable with and that you can teach.
So do you remember that a few years ago, like in 2010, and the graduate student at Harvard University, they were paid like $30,000 a year, which was almost like my salary as my first postdoc. But of course, every city is different. Boston has a higher living cost. But what do you see that as a grad student, even though the pay is not that great, you don't have to take a second job in order to make the life manageable, right?
Yeah. So for me, what I get paid, it covers like my rent and stuff, and I can go grocery shopping and do that. So it covers my living expenses and everything. So yeah, and that's kind of why like the stipends you get will vary by university, just because living expenses are different just across states and cities. and at least the advice that I got given was that when I started to get these offer letters was to like compare how much they were going to be paying me to like the cost of living in that area, and to see if I would be able to like afford to live there with like what I would be getting paid and doing that. And I thought that was really helpful advice, because this kind of like I didn't actually like think about doing that necessarily, and I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, I should do that. So yeah.
You said you were going to maybe link the website that talked about, or like that you mentioned about, yeah, I was wondering if we can do that, because I'm doing marine biology as my major.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let me put that in the chat.
Sorry.
Okay. I have the link. And then I'll put in another one. Assuming it loads. Okay. And then the cool thing about, at least with the Jordy's resolution, they have like a website thing, and you can also, like, if you're doing outreach at all, anything like marine related, they have things that you can request. It doesn't cost you anything. All you have to do is email the contact information that they have, and you can request like core replicas. They have like 4 or 3 of them. It'll be like a replica of exactly what a section of core they recovered from a particular area looks like. So they have like the dinosaur extinction one. They have one from the Antarctic Peninsula about like paleoclimate. And they have like 2 others, I believe. But they also have like stickers and pencils and stuff you can request too. And it's all like free. They just will send them to you if you just tell them like your address and everything, and how many of them you need, and do that. And they have a whole ton of cool posters too. Just FYI.
Any other questions? We have like 2 more minutes. We already used Lauren's a lot of her research time this morning. So.
I don't know. Like, this has been fun. Like, I enjoy casual conversation about. I don't
Well,
know.
if you have more questions, so do you mind that in the future, if our students have some questions for you, can they send emails to you? I think I have emails. All right.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, happy to answer questions like further down the road or anything, or chat again and do that. Yeah.